The sun was sinking below the horizon when Kevin drove up to his aunt's house. The small suburban area looked as quiet and peaceful as ever. It was one of those places where people knew each other, where in the evening you can only hear the noise of the TV through the slightly open windows and the noise of cars rarely passing along the street. Kevin parked on the side of the road and got out of the car. He looked at the house. The light in the windows was warm, and it made him feel even more comfortable. Aunt Diana always knew how to create an atmosphere at home that made you forget about all the problems. Her house seemed like an island of peace in this troubled world. But today he had a strange feeling that something was going to change, although he couldn't figure out what exactly. He adjusted his backpack on his shoulder and headed for the gate. It gave way under his hand with a familiar creak, as if reminding him of all those summers he spent here as a teenager. But now he was not the young guy who was always running around the yard. In recent years, Kevin has grown up, matured, and with each visit here, he felt that Diana was changing in his eyes. She was no longer just a kind aunt who was always ready to bake pies and tell some family story. Now that her husband was on a business trip, Kevin realized that he was going to her, knowing that it would be just the two of them. And it bothered him a lot more than he wanted to admit. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. For some reason, my heart started beating faster. The sound of footsteps outside the door was distinct, confident. Her footsteps. She knew it was him, and she was expecting him. When the door opened, Diana greeted him with a warm, wide smile that warmed him as always. But something in her gaze was different. He couldn't immediately figure out what it was.
Kevin, what a meeting. How have you grown up?
Her voice was filled with joy and surprise. She stepped up to him and hugged him tightly, pressing herself against his chest. The scent of her perfume was light, fresh, with notes of something sweet. Kevin hugged her back, maybe a little harder than was appropriate, but it only lasted a second before he released her.
Hi, Aunt Diana. You've changed too, you know.
He took a step back and looked at her. Her hair was neatly tied in a ponytail. A light dress emphasized her figure. She looked different than in his memories. It was hard to describe, but she seemed more attractive to him than when he was younger.
Oh, come on. Do you probably see me quite old now?
No, you're still the same. Only better.
Her eyes widened slightly at his words, but she immediately regained her composure and smiled again. This moment was so brief that it could have gone unnoticed, but Kevin caught it. Perhaps he's not the only one who notices the changes.
Well, come in already. Don't stand on the threshold.
She stepped back to let him enter the house. Kevin walked inside and was immediately enveloped in the familiar smell of homemade cakes. The house had a warm, homely atmosphere, soft light, the smell of fresh coffee and apple pie, which, as it turned out, she had prepared especially for his arrival. Everything was exactly the same as he remembered from childhood, but with a slight hint of something new, barely perceptible. Maybe it was just the effect of time.
Well, how do you like being an adult? It's not what you expected at all, is it?
She walked over to the table, where there were already cups of coffee and a jug of juice.
Yes, let's just say that adulthood did not meet expectations. There is a lot of work, but less and less pleasure.
He sat down at the table, watching her pour him juice. Her movements were smooth, confident. She always seemed calm and balanced, but now he noticed some new details in her. The way she tosses her hair behind her back, the way she smiles at the corners of her lips when she listens to him. She put a glass in front of him and sat down opposite him.
Well, welcome to real life. But don't worry, this is just the beginning. Time will show that everything is still ahead.
They sat in silence for a few moments, enjoying the comfort that surrounded them. But there was something about the silence that kept them from relaxing completely. Kevin felt something slowly begin to spread inside him, some vague anxiety or expectation.
Do you often stay alone when Uncle Martin is away?
Her gaze became more serious for a moment, but she immediately hid it under her usual smile.
Well, business trips have become part of his job. I'm used to it already. Of course, sometimes it's boring to be alone, but I've learned how to fill in the time.
She got up and went to the window, as if she wanted to look at something outside. In fact, it was more like an attempt to hide an instant vulnerability.
Isn't it hard for you? You know when there's no one at home.
He was looking at her back, her slim silhouette in the light of the street lamp. He couldn't help but notice how his words sounded a little more intimate than he had planned. It was as if there was a part of another meaning in this question that both of them were not ready to admit. She turned to him, a slight challenge in her eyes.
Why are you asking, Kev? You don't think I'm sitting here alone and suffering, do you?
She returned to the table and sat down opposite him again. There was a sparkle in her eyes that Kevin didn't remember seeing in her before. Was it a game or something more?
No, of course not. I just asked. Sometimes people get used to loneliness, and sometimes it drives them crazy.
And how are you? You spend a lot of time alone too, right? College probably doesn't always have enough company.
The question caught him off guard. She didn't look away but stared straight into his eyes, as if trying to read something more. Kevin swallowed and turned away for a moment, realizing that the conversation was going somewhere wrong.
Well, I'm doing fine. It's temporary, you know. Everyone has their own business, their own worries, adult life and all that.
He tried to hide his awkwardness with carelessness, but Diana caught it.
Yes, adult life is such a thing. Sometimes she gives you what you didn't expect, and sometimes she takes away what you thought was yours forever.
These words sounded mysterious, and he couldn't help but notice how they hung in the air between them. It was more than just a conversation about life and growing up. Something in their communication began to change, and Kevin felt it with every cell of his body. He wanted to say something else, but at that moment his phone rang, distracting him from his thoughts. He looked at the screen. It was one of his friends from college. But right now, he didn't want to talk to anyone. Kevin disconnected the call and put the phone on the table, trying to focus on the conversation with his aunt.
Won't you answer?
No, nothing important. I'm with you now.
Diana smiled, but there was still that strange shade in her gaze that he couldn't decipher. There was something about their communication that had changed since he arrived. This tension was growing by the minute, and Kevin realized that perhaps their relationship would never be the same. Time passed. It had been a couple of days since Kevin had arrived at his aunt's, and each of those days had become a test for his self-control. They spent a lot of time together. Diana cooked breakfast in the morning. They ate in the kitchen, discussed the latest news and laughed as before. During the day, she showed him the city she hadn't been to in a long time, and in the evenings they watched movies or sat over a glass of wine, discussing everything in the world. Everything seemed so normal, so familiar, but inside Kevin everything was different. His gaze involuntarily lingered on her hands when she waved them in conversation, or on her neck when she straightened her hair. He was haunted by her light touches when she touched his shoulder as she passed by, or when their hands accidentally touched while passing a cup of tea to each other. These little things had never mattered to him before, but now they took on a new, exciting meaning. One evening they were sitting in the living room. The lights were dimmed, leaving most corners of the room in semi-darkness. Diana put 2 glasses and a bottle of red wine on the table, already half empty. Kevin knew he shouldn't drink too much, but the wine relaxed him, helped him get rid of these strange, contradictory thoughts. Both of them were already a little drunk, and frank notes began to appear in their conversation, which had not been there before.
You don't come to visit often, Kev. Why is that?
She was sitting on the couch, her legs slightly raised and facing him. There was something playful in her eyes, but at the same time serious. Kevin sensed that this question was not just a polite interest. She really wanted to understand why he rarely visited her.
Well, studies, work. And to be honest, I thought that you and your uncle were not up to me. You have your own life.
He raised his glass, taking a sip, and looked away. It was hard for him to look her straight in the eye at that moment.
Your own life.
Her voice was a little lower than usual, and there was a hint of irony in it.
Don't you think you're making too much of it? Martin and I are always happy to see you.
Kevin felt that slight electric shock between them again. He knew that the conversation wasn't just about his rare visits. It was about something deeper than their usual family relationship.
Maybe. But you have your own family, your own affairs, and I am no longer the child you once knew.
He tried to keep his voice neutral, but couldn't avoid a slight shiver that ran down his spine. He knew that every time they talked about such a topic, he felt the ground under his feet begin to leave. Diana looked at him. Her gaze softened. She put the glass down on the table and, slightly tilting her head, studied his face.
You've changed, it's true. I'm looking at you now and I see a grown man. You understand that, don't you?
Her words hit him like a hammer. Everything he'd been trying to suppress since he'd entered her house had suddenly become apparent. She saw it. And more than that, she wanted him to understand it.
Yes, I understand. I notice it too.
He put the glass down on the table, feeling that the conversation was going somewhere where it would be difficult for both of them to stay the same. This was the moment when the masks should have fallen off, when they both finally realized what was between them. They sat in silence for a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity. Each of them was trying to figure out what was next. It was the very moment when they both realized that something was changing in their relationship, something they couldn't ignore anymore.
You know, I've been thinking about you more than usual lately.
These words hung in the air between them, like a bell warning that something was about to happen. Kevin couldn't bring himself to answer right away. He felt his stomach tighten, his breathing quicken.
What are you talking about?
He knew what she was talking about, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. He wanted her to say it first, because then he wouldn't have to take on this responsibility. Diana smiled a little, but it was a sad smile. She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to say what was on her mind.
I see the way you look at me, Kev, and I can't ignore it. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but now...
She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. Kevin immediately understood what she meant. His heart was pounding like crazy, and the blood rushed to his face. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. They both found themselves on the brink, where every word could change their relationship forever.
Diana, this is wrong. We can't.
He didn't finish because he wasn't sure what he was going to say. It was so easy to say, this is wrong, but it's so hard to follow it, because he knew it was wrong. But he wanted to keep going anyway. He wanted her. Diana took a step closer, and their eyes met. She no longer tried to hide behind friendly smiles or family jokes. She was as honest as ever.
I know, but you know what? Sometimes right and wrong are just words. You can feel it, can't you?
Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but that made her every word cut like a knife. Kevin felt his hands start to shake. He wanted to tell her that they had to stop, that they couldn't keep doing this. But instead, he heard his own voice, which betrayed him.
Yes, I feel it.
The words came out of his mouth so easily that he was scared himself. He looked at her and saw that she was waiting for this confession, but at the same time she was afraid of it. She came closer, and now there was not even a meter of distance between them. Kevin could feel her breathing, could see her chest trembling with excitement. They stood face to face, almost touching each other. This moment could last forever, and at the same time it could end at any second. They both knew this shouldn't be happening. But now, at this moment, they were ready to ignore all the prohibitions.
We don't have to do anything. It's just... You don't have to pretend that it doesn't exist. Okay.
Her words sounded like a sentence, like a bridge between what they felt and what could happen. Kevin looked into her eyes and saw something more than just love or affection shining in them. It was a passion they both feared. He wanted to retreat, wanted to just walk away, but his legs wouldn't obey. He took a step forward, and now there was not an inch left between them. Her warmth enveloped him, her breath touched his skin.
Diana, we can't.
But instead of answering, she put her hand on his chest, and the touch overshadowed all his thoughts. He knew it was a mistake. He knew that everything was not going where it should have been. But his body, his mind, his heart, everything was against him.
Quiet. Just be here.
Her hand was light, but the full force of their suppressed desires was felt in this touch. Kevin felt his head spin, and his heart beat even faster. He leaned a little closer, feeling her scent, her warmth. And at that moment, time seemed to stop. They stood as if they were waiting for something to happen, but at the same time they were afraid of it. There was a line between them that they both understood, but that no one wanted to cross first. The night overtook them unexpectedly. During the day, they both seemed to be trying to stay as far away from each other as possible, busy with various little things. Kevin was reading a book, trying to concentrate, and Diana was busy cleaning the kitchen. They both knew that this day was just a prelude to the evening that was already on the way. What was going to happen had been in the air since morning, like an invisible ritual that they were drawn to. When the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, the house began to look even more secluded. Silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional sound of a car driving down the street, covered them. Kevin was in the living room, his eyes were glued to the TV screen, but the movie he chose for evening viewing had long since lost its meaning for him. He didn't even remember how this movie started. His mind had been wandering elsewhere for a long time. He thought about what had happened yesterday, about how their conversation had changed, how there was a tension in it that could not be escaped. Diana was sitting on the couch next to her, her legs were tucked under her, and she seemed relaxed. However, Kevin knew that her calmness was just an appearance. He could feel her hand, which had accidentally touched his during the same movie, lingering a little longer than necessary. He felt her gaze turn to him from time to time, but she quickly turned away when he turned his head. It was like a game in which both knew the rules, but no one wanted to be the first to make the next move. The wine they were drinking was gradually starting to take its toll. It drew them to something more outspoken, bold, but the words still remained unspoken. Both were lost in their own thoughts, and it seemed like a battle of wits was unfolding between them, in which each was trying to figure out how far they could go. Kevin felt like something was bursting at the seams inside him. The whole day was filled with a strange tension that he couldn't ignore. This was not an ordinary family meeting. There was something more here, something that went beyond the usual communication between aunt and nephew. He couldn't get the moment when they were so close to each other out of his mind. This feeling did not leave him, no matter how hard he tried to distract himself. He knew that he had to hold on, that all he had to do was relax a little, and everything would go the other way. Diana, in turn, was lost in her own thoughts. She also felt this strange tension. It wasn't easy for her. During these days, she realized that Kevin is no longer the boy she once knew. He had changed, and it bothered her. She noticed his looks, his awkwardness, but at the same time she saw something in him that attracted her. It was wrong, and she knew it. But every time she thought about stopping it all, her body and mind resisted it. These thoughts tormented her all day. She noticed how her own desires began to surface. She tried to suppress them, convincing herself that they were just fantasies, that it was all nothing more than the result of long loneliness and a familiar connection with Kevin. But these fantasies became more and more real. She noticed how she began to pay attention to his movements, his gaze, his gestures. It bothered her because she understood that if she didn't stop, the consequences could be devastating. But at the same time, it was hard for her to resist this feeling. The night grew deeper and deeper, and the tension between them only increased with each passing hour. Kevin could no longer focus on the movie, the books, or anything else. It was hard for him to be around Diana, but he didn't want to leave. His mind was full of contradictions. He knew it was wrong, but every time his thoughts went that way, something flared up inside him, making him forget about all these rules. At some point, Diana got up from the couch and headed to the kitchen, leaving him alone in silence. She was standing at the kitchen table, her gaze fixed on a bottle of wine that was on the table. She knew it was time to end the evening, that they both needed to go to separate rooms and try to sleep, but instead, her hand reached for the bottle. She slowly poured herself another glass and took a long sip. The wine warmed her from the inside out, but it wasn't just the warmth of alcohol, it was something more that pulsed somewhere deep in her chest. She returned to the living room and sat down next to Kevin again. Now they were only a few centimeters apart. He sensed her presence as soon as she approached. Her scent, her closeness, it was all driving him crazy. It seemed to him that he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't focus on his thoughts. Everything seemed blurry and wrong. But despite that, he didn't want to leave. Diana sat in silence. Her thoughts were as restless as Kevin's. She looked at him from under half-closed eyelids, trying to figure out what was going on in his head. Her hand involuntarily twitched in his direction, but she stopped herself. She knew she couldn't do that. It was a moment when everything could have changed, but she wasn't ready to take that step. Kevin felt her tension as strongly as he felt his own. He saw her hand move towards him, but she stopped. It was a moment they would both remember. They were on the edge where every move, every look could destroy everything. He felt that if he did something now, everything would go a different way. The clock on the wall struck midnight, and the sound seemed to cut through the air between them. It was a reminder that the night was already too deep, and that they should have gone to their rooms long ago. but none of them moved. They continued to sit on the couch, staring at the TV screen, which had long since ceased to interest them. Their whole world is now focused on what is happening here and now. Kevin felt something breaking inside him. He knew he couldn't hold on any longer. He knew that if he stayed here another minute, he would do something he would regret later. His mind was telling him to get up, leave, go to his room, close up, and try to forget this evening. But his body resisted. He couldn't get up. His feet seemed to be chained to the floor. Diana couldn't take the strain anymore either. She felt that if she didn't break this chain of events now, everything would get out of control. She understood that their relationship would no longer be the same, that this moment would be the point of no return. But something inside her drew her to him. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop. Her body resisted her mind. At some point, Kevin felt his hand involuntarily move in her direction. He didn't want to do it, but his body no longer obeyed his thoughts. Her warmth attracted him like a magnet. He knew it was wrong, that they both needed to stop, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. The silence around them was becoming unbearable. It was like waiting before a storm the very moment when everything froze, and you know that something is about to happen. Kevin could feel his heart pounding in his chest as his every breath became heavier. He knew he couldn't take the strain anymore. Diana felt it too. She knew that this evening would change them forever. But instead of breaking the chain, she chose to stay. She knew it would be her mistake, but this mistake seemed so sweet, so desirable. They both sat side by side, lost in their own thoughts, each of them trying to figure out how far they were willing to go. There were no words between them, but their every look, every movement said that words were no longer needed. They both had to make a choice that would change everything. The night was quiet, too quiet. There was not a single sound outside, as if the whole world had stopped, leaving Diana and Kevin alone with their thoughts and feelings. The house that had seemed like a safe haven to them was now taking on a different look. The walls that once gave them a feeling of warmth and comfort were now shrinking around them, as if they wanted to keep them in this state of uncertainty and forbidden attraction. Kevin was lying in bed, but sleep was far from him. Every cell in his body was tense, as if he was waiting for something he couldn't put into words. His mind wandered around one thing, Diana. He tried to focus on other things, on trying to fall asleep, but it seemed useless. His whole being was consumed by thoughts of her, of how her presence had taken over his mind. He couldn't get her out of his mind, her gaze, her movements, her touch. Even the most casual touch of her hand was like an electric shock to him, which awakened something long hidden in him. He tried to convince himself that it was wrong, that they couldn't afford to cross that line. But with each passing hour, with each passing moment, his mind was giving up. These thoughts, which until recently seemed forbidden to him, became more and more tempting. He saw her face in front of him, her delicate features, her eyes that looked at him with that sparkle that he could not forget. There was something in her gaze that made him feel different from before. It was the look of a woman, not a relative, and it drove him crazy. The room was stuffy, and this only increased his anxiety. He tried to calm down, but every time he closed his eyes, a picture rose in front of him, Diana, sitting next to him on the couch, their hands barely touching each other, her breath so close that he could feel it on his skin. The whole evening, every moment spent with her, was etched in his memory so vividly that he couldn't get it out of his head. He lay staring at the ceiling, listening to his rapid breathing, and realized that this could not go on. Diana wasn't sleeping either. She was sitting in her bedroom with her arms wrapped around a pillow, and her thoughts were no less restless. At that moment, she felt completely vulnerable, as if she was trapped in her own feelings and desires. Everything she had tried to hide behind a mask of calm and composure was now coming to the surface. Her hands were shaking, she couldn't sit still. Thoughts of Kevin swirled in her head like a whirlpool from which there was no way out. She saw the way he looked at her, saw his gaze, which was not the gaze of his nephew. He looked at her as a woman, and it scared her. But what scared her even more was that she also began to look at him in a different way. These feelings, which she considered unacceptable, awoke in her with unexpected force. She tried to fight it, telling herself that it was just a fleeting attraction that would pass if she could just pull away. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. She could feel him near her, even when he wasn't physically there. His presence permeated her entire being, like a poisonous but sweet smell that she couldn't get rid of. She replayed the moment when they were sitting next to each other, over and over in her head. She remembered how their hands had almost touched, how her heart had started beating faster then. It wasn't just excitement, it was something more, something she couldn't control. She felt like she was on the brink of a precipice, where every step could lead to disaster. But this risk, this danger, seemed unbearably attractive to her. Time passed slowly, as if trying to give them both time to realize what was happening to them. But the more they thought, the stronger the attraction became. Diana could no longer hide from her feelings. She knew it would take time for these thoughts and feelings to cool down, but every minute with Kevin only intensified them. Her mind told her one thing, but her body told her another. She got out of bed and went to the window, hoping that the fresh air would help her cope with this agonizing anxiety. But looking at the street lit by the dim light of the lanterns, she realized that she could not escape from what was happening inside her. Even if she went outside, even if she left this house, thoughts of Kevin would stay with her. They were deeper than simple attraction. It was something that penetrated into her mind, into her blood, into every cell of her body. She went back to bed, but sleep still wouldn't come. Her head was heavy with thoughts, her body tense like a string. She couldn't find a place for herself. At some point she wanted to just get up, go to Kevin's room and tell him everything, to tell him how she feels, to share this heavy burden with him. But every time she was about to do it, her mind brought her back to reality. She knew she couldn't afford it. That would be a mistake, and the consequences could be devastating. But the more she thought about what should be right, the more she realized that her heart was telling her something completely different. These feelings were not something that could be simply suppressed. They were getting stronger every day, every minute. She couldn't ignore them anymore. She knew that if they both didn't find a way to stop, they would inevitably cross the line beyond which there would be no return. Meanwhile, Kevin could no longer stay in bed. He got up and went to the window, looking out at the empty street. The silence around him only increased his inner discomfort. He felt like he had to do something, but he didn't know what it was. He stood peering into the darkness, trying to find answers to the questions that had plagued him for the past few days. It seemed to him that his relationship with Diana had reached an impasse, and the only way out was to admit what was going on between them. But a confession would mean the end of everything they knew. This would mean that they would either have to accept these feelings and destroy everything they had built, or try to forget them, but live with this knowledge for the rest of their lives. Both options seemed unbearable to him. He couldn't imagine that they would be able to return to their previous relationship as if nothing had happened. Everything had changed, and he knew it. Diana knew too. This internal struggle continued in both. Everyone was trying to find an answer that would allow them to maintain their balance, but that balance no longer existed. They were both caught up in a wave of feelings that they couldn't control. It was like a storm that covered them and left no way out. The night went on endlessly. They were both rushing around their rooms, each in their own world, but with the same thoughts. It was like a game on the edge in which no one wanted to take the first step, but it was also impossible to retreat. They both knew that something important was about to happen. It might be their mistake, but this mistake was inevitable. The feelings they were trying to suppress turned out to be stronger than them. It was a forbidden attraction that haunted them. It was more than just a passing wish. It was like a fire that was igniting. It's lazy, but it's getting brighter by the second. And this fire, if not extinguished, was ready to consume them both. They both knew that there would be no turning back in the next step of their lives. But this step seemed inevitable, as well as the fact that they both understood they would no longer be able to hide these feelings. The forbidden attraction captured them completely. The world around them seemed to freeze. The night was unbearably quiet, and in that silence Diana and Kevin were on the edge of a precipice from which they knew it would be impossible to get out. Their every look, every movement was filled with the tension that they had been trying to suppress all these days. But it became impossible to contain it further. The evening turned out to be eventful. They tried to behave as usual. They had dinner, watched a movie, but both Diana and Kevin knew that all this was just a cover. Their thoughts were not focused on ordinary everyday affairs, but on something much more forbidden and frightening. Every moment they spent together only increased their desire to be closer, to break down the wall they had been building for so long. When the movie ended, Diana turned off the TV, and silence reigned in the room. It was not an ordinary silence, but one that envelops the space before the storm. Kevin was sitting on the couch, and his gaze was directed away, avoiding meeting her eyes. But he felt her presence, as if she were closer than she really was. Every breath seemed loud to him, every movement of her body almost tangible. Diana sat down on the edge of the sofa. Her hands were shaking, but she tried to hide it. A storm was raging inside her. Everything she was trying to suppress burst out with incredible force. Her thoughts were chaotic, intertwined between morality and desire. Her mind kept saying one thing: this is wrong. This needs to be stopped, but her body, her heart, disagreed with her. She felt herself drawn to Kevin with a kind of frightening force. It was more than just a physical attraction. It was something that had awakened inside her and no longer wanted to remain hidden. She couldn't fight it anymore, even though she tried. Every look at him, every moment with him, made her heart beat faster. And now, in that silence, she realized that the moment of truth had come. Kevin was sitting next to her, and his heart was pounding so hard that he was afraid she would hear. Everything that has been happening these days has come to a climax. He knew that he was on the very edge, where he could still take a step back and put everything back in its place. But at the same time, he felt that to take a step back was to betray himself, to betray what he felt. All that held him back was the thought that he and Diana were connected by family ties, that their relationship should never have crossed that line. But this boundary was so fragile that now she could no longer hold them. Diana slowly got up and went to the window, as if trying to find the answer to her questions there. Her steps were slow but confident. She stopped and looked out at the street, illuminated by the dim light of the lanterns. The silence of the night seemed unnatural, as if the whole world was waiting for them to make their choice. Something clicked inside her, as if all the internal barriers had collapsed in an instant. She felt that she could no longer hold on to the old principles, to the rules that she had set for herself. Everything she knew was destroyed. Kevin was no longer the boy she had once known. He had become a man, and now it drew her to him with such force that she could no longer resist. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, but her mind was too overwhelmed with emotions. She knew there was no point in resisting anymore. Kevin also realized that this moment had come. His whole body was tense, and every nerve in his body was stretched like a string. He felt her, felt this strange connection between them, which was getting stronger. All that held him back was the remnants of his mind, which told him that they couldn't do it. But these remnants of reason became quieter and quieter under the onslaught of emotions that took over his head. He slowly got up from the couch and walked over to her. His footsteps were quiet, as if he was afraid to break the fragile silence that surrounded them. But at the same time, a storm was raging inside him. He knew that this moment would change everything. All he had to do was hold out his hand, and their relationship would never be the same again. Diana felt his approach, although she did not turn her head. She knew it was inevitable. Their attraction has become too strong to ignore. She had tried to resist it, but now it seemed impossible. She could feel his breath, his warmth. It was so close, so real, that her heart stopped for a moment. Kevin stopped for a moment, standing behind her. He wanted to stop, to give himself another opportunity to rethink everything. But at the same time, he knew it was too late. This moment was inevitable. He reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. This touch was like a spark that ran through their bodies, connecting them in one inexpressible sensation. Diana didn't turn away. She stood there, feeling his touch, and her heart was beating so fast that she thought she would pass out. At that moment, she realized that she could no longer fight what was happening. She turned her head and looked at him. Their eyes met, and in that look there was everything: fear, desire, doubt, passion. Everything was mixed up together, and neither of them could look away. They stood like that for a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity. It was that moment when everything was on edge, when the world around them seemed to disappear. Kevin felt his hand slowly slide down her back, and that touch was like a fire that filled his whole being. He couldn't control himself anymore. It was more than he could bear. Diana could feel his touch driving her crazy. She knew she couldn't stop anymore. All these days she had been trying to escape from these feelings, but now they had captured her completely. She turned slowly towards him, her eyes full of passion and determination. She took a step forward, and at that moment their bodies touched. This moment was like an explosion. All the pent-up emotions, all the suppressed desires burst out. It was more than just physical intimacy. It was something deeper, something that connected them on a level they were both afraid to admit. Their hands met, and at that moment, everything around them ceased to exist. The whole world has narrowed down to the two of them. Kevin could feel her touch making him lose control. He could no longer think about what was right and what was wrong. All that mattered was them. Diana felt it too. Her body responded to his every touch, her mind clouded. Everything they had been holding back was now bursting out with incredible force. They couldn't pretend anymore. It was their decision, their step into the unknown. Everything that had happened before seemed far away and unimportant. Now there was only this moment, their passion, their desire. They took the first step that will change their lives forever. This step was full of fear and at the same time a huge release. This was the moment when all the internal prohibitions collapsed, when all the restrictions that they had set for themselves no longer mattered. It was like falling into an abyss, but this fall was sweet, it was welcome. They allowed themselves this moment, and in that moment there was everything fear, pain, passion, love. This was the release they were both looking for without even realizing it. There was no turning back now. This step changed them forever, but at the same time it was something they had both been waiting for all their lives. The morning came unexpectedly. The dark veil of night slowly receded, giving way to the first light of dawn, but instead of a feeling of renewal and hope, the morning brought with it only anxiety. The room was quiet, but that silence was no longer cozy and soothing. It became oppressive, as if the space around them was shrinking under the pressure of their own thoughts. Everything that had happened between them during the night now weighed on them like a heavy burden from which it was impossible to escape. Kevin was lying on the bed. His body was motionless, but his mind was in chaos. He stared at the ceiling, unable to focus on anything. His mind was racing, trying to find at least some logical thread that could explain how they got to this point. The night he spent with Diana was not just the result of their passion, it was something more, something that he could not fully comprehend. He felt lost, as if the whole world around him had collapsed, leaving him among the rubble. He could no longer see in Diana the same woman he had known since childhood. She was something more, a woman with whom he had experienced something forbidden, but that made it even more attractive. But now, as the light of day began to penetrate the room, reality pressed down on him with all its force. He realized that he had made a huge mistake that could not be corrected. His whole world, all his beliefs, were destroyed. He couldn't understand how they had allowed this to happen. He knew it was wrong, but the moment their bodies merged, everything that was right lost all meaning. Now that the passion has receded, it has been replaced by the painful realization that they have gone too far. He couldn't stay still any longer. He needed to move, to do something, just not to be alone with his thoughts. He slowly got out of bed, feeling heavy in his body, as if this night had left a mark on his every move. He went to the window, opened it, and breathed in the fresh morning air. It was necessary, at least something real to cling to at this moment, when everything else seemed illusory. Diana was in the next room. She had not slept for several hours, although her body remained motionless. Her mind was as chaotic as Kevin's. She was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and could not fully comprehend what had happened. Every nerve in her body screamed at her that what they had done was wrong. But at the same time, deep down, she knew that she would never regret this moment. She knew it was inevitable. Everything in their relationship was coming to this, no matter how much they both tried to deny it. She closed her eyes, trying to find the strength to accept the reality in which they now found themselves. Thoughts were spinning in her head that they would not be able to continue living the way they used to. Their relationship has changed forever, and now they have to make a choice. But what to do? How do I get everything back? How can we make sure that all this does not ruin their lives? These questions were pressing on her every second, and there was no answer to them. Diana got out of bed and slowly headed to the bathroom. The water running down her face was cold, but it didn't help her recover. She was looking in the mirror, but she couldn't recognize her reflection. It seemed that a completely different woman was standing in front of her, not the one she was yesterday. She was aware that what had happened was caused by more than just attraction. It was something that stretched much deeper, that lay on the border of fear, desire and suppressed emotions that had accumulated over the years. But now that everything had come out, something had to be done about it. They both understood that this was not just a moment of weakness. It was something that changed them forever. But what's next? How to live with this knowledge? How do you look into each other's eyes, knowing what happened between them? They understood that now they had to make a decision. But each of them was afraid of this moment, because they knew that any decision would have its consequences. Kevin left the room and headed for the kitchen. He tried to behave as usual, pour himself coffee, make toast. But his movements were slow and hesitant, as if he was afraid that any action might destroy the fragile shell they were both trying to preserve. He stood at the window, holding a cup in his hands, and looked out at the street, but his thoughts were far from everything that was happening around him. Diana joined him a few minutes later. She looked calm, but her eyes betrayed all the storm that was going on inside her. They stood in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. This silence was unbearable because it said much more than any words. They both knew that a conversation was inevitable, but neither knew where to start. Kevin felt that something irreversible was hanging between them. It wasn't just a mistake that could be forgotten. It was a decision that changed their lives, and now they would either have to accept it and move on, or try to take it all back, even though they both knew it was impossible. For the next hour, they both tried to mind their own business, but the tension grew. Diana started to clean the kitchen, but her movements were abrupt and nervous. She felt like everything was boiling inside her, like her emotions were rushing out. She couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore. Kevin tried to focus on the little things, but his mind was preoccupied with what had happened between them. He knew it wasn't just a physical attraction. It was more than he could explain. And that made it even scarier. It was lunchtime, and the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. They both knew that it couldn't go on like this. Something had to be decided, but both were afraid to take the first step, because they knew that this decision would change everything. They could no longer hide behind the familiar roles of aunt and nephew. Their relationship had changed forever, and that knowledge weighed heavily on them. Kevin was trying to sort himself out. He knew that their bond was stronger than just a family one. But what now? How could he go on living knowing that he had destroyed something sacred? These thoughts tormented him like poisonous thorns, and he did not know how to deal with them. Diana suffered too. She knew she couldn't ignore what had happened. But what to do? She knew she had to make a decision that would change their lives. She dreaded this moment because she knew that any decision would be devastating. But it was impossible to retreat. Eventually, the day came to an end and the tension reached its peak. They both knew that conversation was inevitable. It was necessary to understand what they would do next. But each of them was afraid of this moment. They understood that this conversation would change everything, and there would be no turning back. Kevin felt a fire burning inside him that he could no longer contain. He knew that their relationship had changed, and trying to ignore it would be a mistake. But how to live on? How to deal with this feeling of guilt and desire at the same time? These questions haunted him. Diana understood that they could no longer hide from reality. Everything had changed, and now they had to accept it. But what's next? She couldn't find the answer to this question, and that scared her the most. The night fell again, and the house became quiet. But this silence was different. She was no longer calm. It was the silence before the storm, before they had to make a decision that would change their lives forever. It all started as something fleeting, barely perceptible. The moment they couldn't help themselves and succumbed to their attraction, Diana and Kevin already knew that the consequences would be inevitable. But excitement, passion, and adrenaline proved to be stronger than common sense. Now that they were alone with themselves and their thoughts, they had to realize that this was not just an accidental mistake. Kevin and Diana struggled with themselves, with guilt, judgment, and fear of what would happen next. Diana was sitting in the kitchen in the semi-darkness, clutching a cup of hot coffee in her hands. She couldn't get rid of the images of the previous evening, the way their gazes crossed, how she felt him coming, and then their first kiss, gentle but restrained. And then it all grew with such force that it took her breath away. She didn't think about her husband or the consequences. All that existed then was the moment and the feeling of his hands on her body. But now there was another reality in front of her. She betrayed the trust of her husband, the man with whom she had been building a life for the past 10 years. But she couldn't deny that the feelings she had for Kevin were real. Was it a mistake? Or is it something more that her subconscious has been trying to say all these years? Diana felt her heart tighten. She glanced at her watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and Kevin still hadn't returned from his walk. She knew that he had gone to think about everything that had happened, but the silence oppressed her. Her mind was wandering, trying to find answers to questions that seemed unsolvable. Her thoughts were interrupted by panicked outbursts. What have I done? What will happen next? There was the sound of footsteps outside the window, and Diana realized that Kevin had returned. Soon he appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was tense, his gaze serious. He had obviously spent the last few hours thinking too.
I thought you were already asleep,
he said softly, sitting down opposite her. His voice was deep and a little tired.
I couldn't sleep.
She replied weakly, looking at her cup.
Too many thoughts.
There was an awkward pause. Both were silent, as if each was waiting for the other to start this difficult conversation. Diana felt something pressing down on her from the inside, as if the air had become heavier and her heart was beating faster.
We need to talk.
Kevin broke the silence, looking at her with a mixture of regret and determination.
What happened? I can't ignore it, and I'm not sure I want to.
Diana looked up sharply, feeling something strange flare up in her, a mixture of fear and desire. She couldn't ignore it either, but the consequences of their relationship were becoming clearer.
I do not know how to explain this.
She began slowly, her voice trembling slightly.
This is wrong, Kevin. I betrayed you. She betrayed her husband. And you. You're my nephew. How did we get to this point?
Kevin raised his hand, interrupting her.
Diana, listen to me. We both feel it, and I do not know if we can just forget about everything. Yes, I understand that this is wrong, but you also know that this is not an accident. This is not just a passing impulse.
Diana stared into his face, trying to find some kind of answer there. He was right, it wasn't an accident. Her heart was divided. Part of her still felt love and devotion for her husband, but another, quieter and more dangerous part, felt that Kevin had awakened something in her that she had not felt for a long time.
But how? How can we live with this? We can't even be together, Kevin. It will destroy everything.
Kevin bit his lip, seemingly trying to put his thoughts together.
And if we can't forget, what then? Are we just going to live with this lie, this constant internal conflict? Pretend that nothing happened? I'm not sure I can do it.
Diana lowered her eyes again. Images of her husband appeared in her mind, his trust, his love. How could she forget about everything so easily? How could she betray the man she shared everything with like that? But then, next to this image, another vision arose. Kevin, young, passionate, full of life. She felt in his presence the lightness that she had long lost in marriage. This connection was new and exciting, and that scared her the most.
I'm not sure how to handle this, she whispered, as if she wasn't talking to Kevin, but to her own thoughts.
Kevin sighed and leaned forward, leaning on the table.
I don't know either. But I know one thing: I don't want to lose you, Diana. You mean more to me than just an aunt or a family. What happened between us? This is not a mistake. I feel it, and I know you feel it too.
Diana couldn't deny his words. She really felt something more. But how to explain it? How could she admit to herself that her heart could be torn in two? She got up and went to the window to hide her weakness, but her voice betrayed her.
I can't live like this, Kevin. It's too complicated. It hurts. I feel like I'm losing myself.
Kevin walked over to her and gently touched her shoulder. He knew that there was an abyss between them, and it was scary to bridge it, but there was no choice. They've gone too far.
We'll find a way out, Diana. I do not know how, but we have to try. If that's what you want.
Diana stood in silence, feeling his presence next to her. She knew she couldn't give him an answer right now. Her feelings were too confused, and her mind was paralyzed by fear. After the first intimacy between Kevin and Diana, they both found themselves in a maze of their feelings and contradictions. Their every interaction was now tinged with unbearable tension. They knew that everything had changed, and this feeling was depressing. The attraction between them became even stronger, but the realization that their relationship must remain a secret put a heavy burden on them. Every day turned into a battle between desire and duty. Diana spent more and more time alone, thinking about what had happened and what she and Kevin had done. Tension was building up at home. Her husband had no idea about anything, but Diana felt that his love and trust were weighing on her more than ever. Kevin's waiting was also becoming agonizing. Every time he approached the house, she froze in anxious expectation, not knowing how to behave, what to say. Kevin wasn't just a nephew to her. He was the one who made her heart beat faster, made her feel young and desirable. This attraction was dangerous, but it dominated her. Kevin, on the other hand, was experiencing excruciating excitement and passion. He couldn't get the moments they spent together out of his mind. The desire to be with Diana over and over again grew in his heart. Every time their eyes met, he felt that an invisible spark was passing between them, ready to flare up and ignite a flame. One evening, when Diana's husband went to a nearby town on business, she and Kevin found themselves alone again. This was the moment they were both waiting for and dreading at the same time. Diana was sitting on the couch, nervously fiddling with the edge of her sweatshirt, when she heard Kevin enter the house. He carefully closed the door, trying not to make too much noise.
Are you alone? What is it? He asked softly, coming closer.
Yes, she replied without looking up. He's gone away for a few days.
Silence filled the room. Both understood that they were here for a reason. There was tension, excitement, and fear in the air. Kevin slowly sat down next to her, barely touching her with his hand.
Have you thought about it? About us?
His voice was full of uncertainty and hope, as if he himself did not fully believe that this situation was real. Diana raised her head and looked at him. Her eyes were full of contradictions. Passion burned in them, but pain was hidden with it.
Of course I did, she whispered. But I do not know how long we can continue this. It's driving me crazy.
She took his hand and squeezed it tightly, as if trying to find support.
Do you want to stop?
These words were uttered with a quiet plea. He was afraid to hear the answer, afraid to lose this connection, even if it was forbidden. Diana couldn't answer right away. She knew that if they stopped now, it would be the right decision, but there was a passion in her heart that wouldn't let her back down.
I do not know, she said at last. I just can't stop thinking about you, but every time I see him, every time he looks at me, I feel terrible.
She let go of his hand and stood up, starting to pace the room. She looked lost, like a person who was entangled in her own emotions.
Kevin, we can't just live a double life. This is wrong. You do understand that, don't you?
Yes, I understand. But what if I don't want to lose you?
He got up and came closer to her. His heart was beating faster and faster. He knew that if he didn't tell her everything now, he might never be able to do it again.
You feel the same way, don't you? It's more than just a wish. It's something real, something that won't disappear, even if we try to forget.
Diana stopped and met his gaze. She saw sincerity and passion in his eyes, but she also saw his youth and inexperience. He still did not understand how difficult this situation was, did not realize how devastating the consequences could be.
This is real, Kevin, she said, coming closer. But it's also dangerous. I can't just destroy everything I have. I can't ruin his life. And yours.
Her voice was trembling, and she was fighting back tears.
I'm not asking you to ruin your life. I just want you to be honest with me. And with yourself.
He reached out and gently touched her face.
If you tell me that it was a mistake, and that you don't feel anything for me, I'll leave. I won't bother you anymore. But if you feel the same way I do.
Diana felt a real storm of emotions unfold inside her. She knew that at this moment she had to make a choice. Either she will follow reason, or she will succumb to feelings. Her heart was beating with incredible force, and at that moment she realized that she couldn't lie to Kevin. She really felt something real for him, something that went beyond mere desire. But these feelings were forbidden, and every step forward could be destructive.
I can't say I don't feel anything, she whispered. But I also can't ignore the consequences.
Kevin gently stroked her cheek.
Then, let's be careful. No one should know. We can just be together without destroying other lives.
Diana closed her eyes, feeling his touch, his warmth. She knew that the offer was tempting, but somehow she also knew that it was impossible. There is too much at stake.
It's not as easy as it seems. Secrets always come out sooner or later. And if that happens, everything will collapse.
But until that happens, we have time. We can be together. Isn't it worth the risk?
Diana took a step back, as if trying to regain control of her thoughts. She knew Kevin was right. Time is all they have. But she also knew that every moment spent with him would only bring them closer to the edge. There is a new element in their relationship: secrecy. They both knew that if anyone found out about their feelings, it would destroy their worlds, and this fear both held them and attracted them to each other. In the weeks that followed, their meetings became more infrequent and intense. They avoided talking for too long, kept their distance in the presence of others, but every glance, every casual touch made their hearts beat faster. Diana became even more cautious. She began to think carefully about every detail: when and how they meet, how to make sure that no one suspects their connection. Her husband did not notice anything suspicious, but this only increased the feeling of guilt. Kevin, despite his youth and lack of experience in such situations, was ready for any sacrifice for the sake of this connection. For him, secrecy became part of a game where his happiness was at stake. He didn't think about the long-term consequences, he only cared about the present. However, time is inexorable. The more they hid their feelings, the stronger their attraction became, and the clearer it was that they would not be able to continue like this for long. With each passing day, Diana and Kevin's relationship became more strained. Their feelings, which at first were just a spark ignited during rare secret meetings, now turned into a flame that they could barely hide. They knew they were still walking on thin ice. Their relationship was not only morally forbidden, but also threatened to destroy everything they had. But with each meeting, this risk became more acute and attractive. Diana became more and more withdrawn into herself. Her feelings for Kevin were getting worse every day, and it made her uneasy. She began to notice little things that had previously escaped her attention: the too close stares of the neighbors, the displeased and sometimes suspicious glances of her husband. She tried not to draw attention to herself, but her inattention was reflected in her external behavior. Sometimes she noticed how her husband looked at her with a question in his eyes, as if trying to understand something, but did not dare to ask directly. These moments created fear and paranoia in her. It seemed to her that every little thing, every action of hers, could betray their connection. When she stayed in the kitchen longer than usual, or when her gaze accidentally rested on Kevin, she immediately began to fear that someone might notice it. An inner voice kept telling her, this is too risky, but she couldn't stop. The attraction to Kevin was too strong, and the moments spent with him seemed to be her only escape from the monotonous and empty life she had lived in recent years. Kevin, for his part, was also beginning to feel threatened by disclosure. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to hide his feelings for Diana. He noticed how his behavior changed in her presence. Previously, he could easily maintain a distance, behave calmly, but now her every look, her every touch seemed more meaningful to him, and it did not escape the attention of others. It was especially difficult to maintain a semblance of normality when they were gathering with family or friends. Kevin began to notice that people around him became more attentive to their communication. Sometimes it seemed to him that one of the guests suspected that there was something more going on between them than just a family connection. Once his cousin, noticing how Kevin was looking at Diana too intently, jokingly asked, "Are you by any chance in love with our aunt?" Then he laughed and waved it away, but inside he felt a cold sweat run down his back. It was a harmless joke, but it made him wonder what if someone really guessed. These moments made him uneasy. Every time someone took a long look at them, he started to panic. He tried to act naturally, but his inattention only grew. He didn't want anyone to find out about their relationship, not because he was ashamed of his feelings, but because he understood that it would ruin Diana's life. He saw how she was suffering, torn between her marriage and her feelings for him. Over time, Kevin began to notice that Diana was increasingly acting aloof and withdrawn. She was no longer the kind of woman who happily accepted his secret meetings and looked for opportunities to spend time together. Now she seemed more nervous, often finding excuses not to be alone with him, and this made him uneasy. He realized that she was afraid that they might be exposed. This fear began to be transmitted to him. One of the moments that finally undermined their confidence that they could continue to hide their relationship was Diana's casual conversation with a neighbor. One day, when Diana was walking down the street, she met Maria, a woman with whom they had been friends for many years. Maria was always observant, and Diana knew that she saw more than she said. During the conversation, Maria suddenly said, "How is your nephew? He started visiting a lot. Probably misses you, right?" This simple phrase sounded like a bolt from the blue. Diana smiled and replied something inarticulate, but inside she felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. She realized that people were starting to notice their meetings. They may not suspect anything wrong yet, but the longer they continue this, the more likely it will be that someone will guess. After this conversation, Diana began to worry more and more. She felt the walls around her shrink as the pressure of society, views and opinions became unbearable. It seemed to her that every person she met on the street knew about her secret. Every glance cast in her direction was perceived as a condemnation. Her condition did not go unnoticed by her husband. He began to notice that Diana had become more nervous, withdrawn. She often withdrew into herself, could sit in one room for a long time, looking out the window and thinking about something. Her attention to home and family affairs has waned. She was no longer the caring and loving wife she used to be. It was starting to bother him. He asked her questions, tried to find out what was going on with her, but each time he received only evasive answers. Diana did not want to open up, could not admit what was happening, and this further increased his anxiety. With each new meeting with Kevin, the tension grew stronger. They both understood that they were walking on the edge of a precipice, and that each step could be the last. Their secret relationship no longer brought the joy and lightness that it had in the beginning. Now it was a burden that was dragging them to the bottom. Kevin, unlike Diana, did not feel so much guilt about what was happening. He was younger, his emotions and feelings were simpler. He knew that he loved Diana and wanted to be with her, but he couldn't fully grasp the complexity of the situation. It seemed to him that if they were careful, they could hide their relationship for a long time. He did not realize how difficult it was for Diana to be in this situation, torn between love for him and duty to her husband. Diana saw it differently. She understood that their relationship was not just an affair, it was the destruction of her life. Every time she was with Kevin, she was tormented by guilt, her soul ached. She realized that their relationship could not last forever, that sooner or later the truth would come out. And this moment seemed to be getting closer to her. One of the most disturbing moments for Diana was the case when her husband unexpectedly returned home earlier. That day, she and Kevin planned to meet in the kitchen late at night, when everyone was supposed to be asleep. But when Diana heard the key turn in the lock and her husband entered the house, her heart stopped. She quickly sent a message to Kevin not to come, and fortunately he managed to read it in time. But this incident showed her how fragile their situation is. A little more and everything could have collapsed. Now she slept restlessly every night. Every time her husband called her or unexpectedly appeared at home, she was seized with panic. She was afraid that he would find out everything, that someone would see her and Kevin together, that her life would collapse in an instant. The further she went, the more Diana realized that she could no longer live in such fear. The threat of disclosure hung over them like the sword of Damocles, and their every action, every word could become fatal. With each passing day, the tension between Diana and Kevin reached its limit. The secret meetings that had previously brought them joy and excitement were now accompanied by fear and a sense of imminent disaster. The feelings that they had been hiding deep inside for a long time began to burst out, and no matter how hard they tried to maintain control, their relationship inevitably went into crisis. Diana could no longer live in constant fear. Her guilt towards her husband was becoming unbearable. Every time she returned home after meeting Kevin, she was gripped by the painful realization that she had betrayed the man who trusted her and loved her. She began to avoid Kevin, delaying meetings under various pretexts, trying to find an outlet in her usual family life. But even this did not bring relief. While Kevin continued to have strong feelings for Diana, he began to feel that something was changing. Her detachment could not go unnoticed. She no longer looked at him with the same passion and tenderness as before. Instead, her gaze was filled with worry, fear, and some kind of inner suffering. He couldn't understand why she started avoiding him, and it only increased his own tension. For Kevin, the situation was getting more and more confusing. He loved Diana and was ready to do anything for her, but now he felt that she was moving away from him, trying to hide something. This made him insecure and jealous. Thoughts began to form in his head that maybe she didn't want to be with him anymore, or that her feelings had changed. Every delay, every cancelled appointment seemed to him to confirm these suspicions. Diana, in turn, felt an unbearable sense of guilt. She realized that continuing a relationship with Kevin was not only immoral, but also destructive to herself. Her heart was torn into two parts. One part belonged to her husband, with whom she had lived for many years, and the other was drawn to Kevin, who made her feel alive and desirable. But this attraction became her curse. Now that their relationship threatened to destroy everything she had built over the years, Diana realized she had to do something. She was increasingly thinking about ending her relationship with Kevin, but she lacked the courage. Every time she tried to talk to him about it, she was overcome with fear. She was afraid that by breaking off her relationship with him, she would lose the part of herself that she had gained through their connection. She was also afraid of his reaction, not knowing how he would react to her decision. One day, after a particularly stressful day, Diana decided to meet with Kevin and discuss everything. She felt that she couldn't put this conversation off any longer. Her internal conflict had reached its peak, and she needed to get rid of this burden. When they met, her heart ached. She saw how much Kevin was suffering and understood that their relationship could not continue. But her words stuck in her throat. She didn't know how to start this conversation. Kevin, who had been accumulating feelings of jealousy, resentment and fear all this time, was ready for this conversation, but in his own way. He felt that Diana was going to tell him something, and his fear of a possible breakup made him act impulsively. He began to accuse her of moving away, that she did not want to be with him anymore, that she was afraid to admit her feelings. These words, spoken emotionally, only aggravated their discord. Diana did not expect such a reaction. She was prepared for the conversation to be difficult, but Kevin's accusations hurt her feelings. It seemed to her that he did not understand the depth of her suffering and did not see how hard it was for her to live in this double life. She began to defend herself, to justify herself, trying to explain that her feelings had not changed, but the circumstances were becoming unbearable. However, instead of listening to each other, they became more and more immersed in an emotional quarrel. For Kevin, her words about the impossibility of continuing the relationship sounded like a betrayal. He felt that she was abandoning him, even though she had previously claimed that she loved him. His youth and inexperience in relationships made his reaction harsh and dramatic. He could not accept that their love could be threatened by some external factors, which, in his opinion, were only obstacles that could be overcome. He didn't realize that for Diana, the situation was much more complicated than just love. She was associated with moral, family and social responsibilities. In the midst of the quarrel, Kevin began to talk about how they could continue their relationship if they just hid even better, if they were more careful. But these words only caused Diana even more pain. She realized that he didn't realize the gravity of their situation. For her, it wasn't just a matter of secrecy, it was a matter of her life, her morals, her future. She couldn't afford to go down this path any further, knowing that it would destroy everything around her. With each new word, they moved further away from each other. Their quarrel was filled with emotions, but it was based on misunderstanding and disappointment. Diana realized that she could no longer continue her relationship with Kevin, but she did not know how to explain it to him so that he would understand her motives. She saw how his pain and jealousy distorted his perception of the situation, and this made it even more difficult for them to break up. After a long quarrel, when emotions reached their peak, they both realized that they had come to the point of no return. Diana realized that continuing this relationship further means continuing to destroy her life and Kevin's life. It hurt her to admit it, but she knew that this breakup was inevitable. Kevin, despite his resistance, also began to realize that their relationship could not continue like this. He didn't want to let Diana go, but he realized that they had gone too far. He felt like he was losing her, and the realization tore him apart. But deep down, he knew she was right, their relationship was doomed. At that moment, there was silence. They were both facing the truth, which they could no longer ignore. Their love was real, but she couldn't survive in the conditions that developed around them. Diana knew that it would only destroy them further, and Kevin, despite his emotions, realized that they could not continue to live a lie. This breakup was a painful moment for both of them. Diana left realizing that she had lost not only her love, but also the part of herself that she had gained through her relationship with Kevin. She felt that she had made the right choice, but it did not ease her suffering. Now she had to rebuild her life and her relationship with her husband, which seemed almost impossible to her. Kevin was left alone, filled with bitterness and a sense of loss. He couldn't believe it was over. His love for Diana was something sacred to him, and losing her was unbearable. But he also realized that this love had become a trap for both of them. Now he had to learn to live without her and figure out how to move on. This breakup left them both devastated. They knew they had done the right thing, but it didn't make their pain any less. Now their paths had parted, and each of them had to find their own way, trying to overcome the consequences of this difficult and forbidden relationship. After the painful breakup between Diana and Kevin, both their lives changed radically. Each of them faced the need to rethink not only their relationship, but also themselves. During this period, both faced important questions: what this connection meant to them, how it affected their lives, and what they should do now with their devastated inner world. Diana, returning to her normal life, felt an unimaginable feeling of relief and bitterness at the same time. The breakup with Kevin freed her from the constant fear of revealing and destroying her marriage, but at the same time deprived her of what gave her a sense of vitality and fullness of life. It was as if she had lost a part of herself, the part that was found in moments of passion, excitement, and inner freedom next to Kevin. Now she had to sort out herself and her feelings. Deep down, Diana understood that her love for Kevin was real, but not the kind that could exist in the real world. She began to rethink the nature of their relationship. What was it? True love? Infatuation? Or maybe an escape from something that was missing in her daily life? These thoughts haunted her, forcing her to return again and again to the memories of those moments they spent together. In her head, Diana often replayed those moments when she and Kevin were getting closer, wondering if she could have done otherwise. She wondered if their relationship was the result of the emotional emptiness she felt in her marriage. Her relationship with her husband had long since lost the passion, the spark that had flared up with Kevin. However, now faced with the choice of continuing to live in marriage or leaving her husband, Diana realized that her relationship with Kevin was more a reaction to the lack of attention and emotional intimacy in her family life than true love, which could be called full-fledged. Realizing this, Diana began the process of reconciliation with herself and with her actions. It was difficult for her to accept the fact that she had betrayed her husband, but she understood that her actions were not only the result of personal weaknesses, but also an expression of dissatisfaction with the marriage. She spent a long time analyzing her relationship with her husband, trying to figure out what exactly led her to such a radical act. She realized that for a long time she had ignored the problems that existed in their marriage, and the affair with Kevin was only a catalyst for awareness of these problems. Diana began to think about how she could get her life back on track. Her feelings for Kevin did not disappear instantly, but now they began to be perceived differently. She no longer saw their relationship as the perfect way out of their problems, as it was in the beginning. Her feelings were replaced by a more sober view of reality. She realized that their relationship was the result of an emotional crisis, and not a sincere love that could withstand the trials of life. At the same time, Diana tried to establish a relationship with her husband. She knew that he didn't suspect anything about her relationship with Kevin, but his discontent and suspicions that had accumulated lately were still in the air. She had to not only restore trust in their relationship, but also rediscover the meaning of her marriage. She began to pay more attention to her husband, trying to regain the intimacy that once existed between them, but gradually weakened. She wanted to restore what she had lost, but she wasn't sure she could do it. Every conversation they had, every action Diana took, was now a deliberate step. She understood that her emotional breakup with her husband was one of the key factors that pushed her to have an affair with Kevin. Now she tried to be more open, sincere in her feelings, in order to prevent the repetition of those mistakes that she had already made. But it wasn't easy for her. Despite her efforts, the fear that she had already destroyed something important in their relationship did not leave her. For Kevin, this period also turned out to be a time of serious reflection. After breaking up with Diana, he was overcome by a feeling of emptiness and loss. He couldn't be around her anymore, and every time he thought about her, his heart was filled with bitterness. However, over time he began to realize that their relationship was more complicated than he could understand at first. Kevin has been in an emotional maelstrom for a long time. His love for Diana seemed sincere and pure to him. But now, looking back, he began to realize that his feelings were greatly distorted. He idealized Diana, seeing in her not only a beautiful and confident woman, but also a symbol of something more, a symbol of what he lacked in his own life. He had been impressed by her strength, wisdom, and experience for a long time, but now he understood that her own problems and internal conflicts were hidden behind it. Kevin began to wonder what was really at the heart of their relationship. Was this infatuation the result of his youth and striving for something unattainable? Perhaps Diana represented to him something like a forbidden fruit, an ideal that could not be realized in reality. These thoughts tormented him, and every time he returned to the memories of them together, he felt that he was beginning to understand their true nature more and more. Over time, Kevin came to realize that their romance was not love, but rather an escape for both him and Diana. For him, it was an opportunity to experience something new, more mature, emotionally intense, but it was also an escape from real problems that he himself did not fully realize. He tried to find answers in Diana to his own questions related to his personality, maturity, understanding of love and relationships. Now that their relationship was over, Kevin felt that he needed to not only sort out his feelings, but also understand what this experience really meant to him. He began to notice that his life before Diana was filled with insecurity and self-searching. Their bond, no matter how devastating its end, helped him understand a lot about himself. Kevin began to realize that, to some extent, this story made him grow up, taught him to look at love and relationships more soberly. This process of self-reflection turned out to be painful for Kevin, but necessary. He had been going through the loss of Diana for a long time, but now he was beginning to understand that this loss had become an important lesson in his life. He realized that his relationship with Diana could not continue because it was based not on true intimacy, but on emotional dependence and idealization. For him, Diana was not so much a real person as a symbol of something he was looking for in his life. Now Kevin realized that he needed to focus on himself. Their affair, no matter how painful it was to admit it, helped him see that his own life lacked meaning and inner peace. This opened his eyes to the fact that love is not only passion and emotions, but also maturity, responsibility, mutual understanding, and respect. He began to look for ways to overcome the inner emptiness and find himself, not relying on external relationships as a way to fill in the internal gaps. Diana and Kevin, despite their difference in age and experience, went through a similar process of awareness. For each of them, this connection turned out to be an important lesson, a lesson about the nature of love, passion, responsibility, and themselves. Now, after the breakup, they were on the road to rebuilding their lives, each of which had been profoundly changed by what had happened between them. Their story has become for them not just a love story, but a story of growth, growing up, and self-discovery. They both realized that their bond was not so much love as a reflection of their inner conflicts and dissatisfactions. Now that their paths had parted, they had to continue living, realizing that each of them had learned an important lesson about themselves and their relationship with the world. After months of introspection and internal struggle, Diana and Kevin began to realize that their relationship, so powerful and destructive in the past, had become an important stage in their lives, but now it was behind them. Both made the final decision to move forward, realizing that their story was an unstable, temporary flash in life that showed them new facets of themselves, but could not last forever. Now they faced the need to take new steps, make final decisions, and start building their lives anew, but without illusions and internal contradictions. For Diana, this process turned out to be particularly difficult. Her life returned to its usual rhythm. She continued to fulfill her duties as a wife and hostess, but now everything seemed different to her. The shadow of her relationship with Kevin still stood between her and her husband. Every morning, when she woke up next to him, Diana felt that their connection had lost something important, and it was impossible to return it. Despite her efforts to restore emotional intimacy in her marriage, she realized that her inner world had changed forever. After breaking up with Kevin, Diana plunged into deep thoughts about her life. Now that the affair was over, she had more time to reflect on her actions and understand why her life had taken such a path. She began to pay more attention to her marriage, trying to find in it the lost connection that she had previously been looking for in Kevin. However, every step she took in this direction reminded her that her relationship with her husband had long cooled down. Over the years, they got used to each other, and their marriage became more like a habit than a living bond between two loving people. Diana realized more and more that she lacked inner freedom and self-realization. Earlier, when she was younger, her marriage seemed to her to be something unshakable, based on love and respect. But over the years, that confidence began to fade. Her husband was absorbed in his work, and their communication gradually reduced to discussing everyday issues and everyday worries. This was the reason for her betrayal. The affair with Kevin became a way for her to feel alive and desirable again. However, now that the passions have subsided, she realized that love is not only excitement and passion, but also a willingness to work on relationships, deepen understanding and intimacy. Diana decided not to destroy her marriage, but also not to live in the illusion that she would be able to return it to its former state. She realized that her future lay not in trying to resurrect an old love, but in finding a new basis for their marriage, which would be based on honesty, openness and understanding. She decided to talk honestly with her husband, not revealing all the details of her infidelity, but explaining her inner feelings and how she felt in recent years. She realized that she needed to open up, otherwise their relationship could never get better. This conversation was a turning point for her. She saw that her husband really loved her, but he himself had suffered from their estrangement for a long time. He was ready to work on a relationship, but he didn't know how to do it. Their frank conversation was the first step towards restoring their bond. Diana made the decision that she needed to give her marriage a new chance. She decided to put the past behind her and focus on the future, working on her relationship with her husband and bringing back more sincerity and mutual understanding. For Kevin, this period also became a time of important awareness. After breaking up with Diana, he felt devastated and lost. For the first time in his life, he was faced with such a deep emotional attachment, which led to such serious consequences. His youth and inexperience in relationships made this connection even more important to him, and losing it was a heavy blow to him. However, over time, he began to rethink not only their relationship, but also his own life. For a long time, Kevin lived with the feeling that his relationship with Diana was not just an affair, but something much more. He saw in her not only the object of his love, but also a way to escape from his own uncertainty. His youth, lack of experience and understanding of real relationships led him to idealize Diana and their relationship. However, after the breakup, he began to realize that their romance was more of an emotional escape than true love. Kevin began to ask himself questions about what he really wanted from life. Before meeting Diana, his life was filled with uncertainty. He did not know where to move, what to do, and what kind of person he wanted to become. Their relationship became a kind of anchor for him, which gave him a temporary sense of confidence and stability. But now that that anchor was gone, he had to find his own place in life. The process of realizing and reassessing relationships has become an important stage of personal growth for Kevin. He realized that he could not build his life based on dependence on another person. Diana became an important lesson for him, showing that love is not only emotions and passion, but also responsibility, maturity, and the ability to build relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. After the breakup, Kevin decided to focus on himself. He realized that in order to build a healthy and strong relationship in the future, he needs to first figure out himself and his goals. This process was not easy for him, but he realized that it was necessary. He began to devote more time to his development, professional activities and personal interests. He had to face the fact that many of his previous ideas about life were illusions, and now he had to find his own way, without relying on someone else. Time helped Kevin see that his connection with Diana, despite her destructiveness, was an important stage in his growing up. Now that he has experienced this pain of loss, he has become stronger and wiser. He realized that true love cannot be based on secrets and dependence. Love should be honest, open and mature. This realization was an important step for him on the path to inner growth. Diana and Kevin, despite the complexity and drama of their relationship, eventually learned important lessons for themselves. Their relationship was a brief flash that changed their lives, but could not last forever. Now that they have both made the decision to move on, they realize that this novel was a turning point for them, which helped them see that love is not always what it seems at first glance. Diana realized that true intimacy and love require effort and openness. She decided to work on her marriage and return to it those aspects that had been lost over the years of living together. Her connection with Kevin had shown her that her feelings and desires were important, but now she realized that she couldn't look for answers to her inner problems in a relationship with someone else. She needed to return to herself, find harmony in herself, and build a relationship with her husband on a new basis on mutual understanding and support. Kevin, in turn, realized that his relationship with Diana was an important stage in his development as a person. He realized that love cannot be based on illusions and emotional dependence. Now he is focused on his own development, on finding his own path and goals. He learned to appreciate himself and his feelings, and realized that love will come when he is ready for it internally, and not when he will look for it as a way to escape from his problems. Thus their story came to an end, but it did not become the end for them. They both changed, grew up, and became stronger because they went through this difficult relationship. Their paths diverged, but each of them learned important lessons from this experience that will help them build healthier and happier relationships in the future. It's been a few days since Diana and Kevin succumbed to their feelings. The morning after that night, the house was quiet. Neither of them dared to be the first to start a conversation about what had happened. Diana was sitting in the kitchen, mechanically stirring a cup of coffee with a spoon. Thoughts were floating in her head that this was a mistake, that this should not have happened. Her hands were shaking, and her gaze was wandering around the room. Kevin also felt out of place. He sat in his room, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince himself that it was just a moment of weakness, a momentary loss of control. But every thought of Diana made his heart beat faster. He knew that he had to leave, at least for a couple of days, to sort out his feelings, what had happened between them. Unable to stand the tension, Kevin went to the kitchen door. He didn't know how to start a conversation, but he knew that it was impossible to stay in this house together right now.
Diana, I need to leave. I think it's best for both of us.
He said it almost in a whisper, hoping that she would take his decision as a sign that he understood what happened between them was wrong. Diana looked up at him. There was a mixture of relief and regret in her gaze, but she quickly tried to hide her emotions.
Yes, that's probably right. We both need some time to think.
Her voice sounded calm, but inside everything was boiling. She couldn't get last night out of her mind, his touch, the passion they shared. She knew it had to stop, but her heart wouldn't agree. Kevin nodded and started packing. The whole process felt unreal, as if he was looking at everything from the outside. There was a struggle raging inside him. On the one hand, common sense told him to put an end to it before things went too far, and on the other hand, every time he thought about Diana, a passion awakened in him that was impossible to ignore. When Kevin left the house, Diana was left alone. She sat down on the sofa, hugging her knees. Now that he's gone, the silence in the house has become unbearable. His scent was still in the room, and his things were still on the table. She felt his presence in every corner of the house. The next few days seemed to drag on in a fog. Diana tried to distract herself with work, household chores, but all thoughts invariably returned to the moment when everything changed. She found herself missing Kevin, the way he talked, the way he looked at her. Every evening she found herself hoping to hear a knock on the door, but instead she was greeted by the same silence. Kevin, after leaving home, tried to immerse himself in his own affairs. He rented a hotel room for a few days, hoping that the distance would help him sort out his thoughts. But neither work nor meetings with friends could distract him from thoughts about Diana. He remembered her smile, her look, her touch. Every night he fell asleep with her image in front of his eyes, and every day it became more difficult for him to fight this feeling. One evening, unable to stand it any longer, Kevin got behind the wheel and drove back. He knew it was a bad idea, that he should have given them both time to think, but his heart wouldn't listen to his mind. He thought that Diana might be having a hard time right now, that she, like him, was struggling with these feelings. When he pulled up to the house, his heart was pounding. He lingered in the car, not knowing how she would meet him, but the determination to come back and talk was stronger. Diana heard the sound of a car and froze. Her heart stopped for a moment when she saw Kevin getting out of the car through the window. She hadn't expected him to return so soon. Excitement overwhelmed her, and she couldn't figure out which she was feeling more joy or fear. Kevin knocked on the door, although he had always just walked in before. Diana came over, slowly opening the door, and for a moment they just stared at each other in silence.
You're back.
Her voice was low, almost uncertain, as if she was afraid to admit her feelings out loud.
I am. I couldn't stay away. I've tried, Diana, but it's impossible. All I can think about is you.
His voice was full of pain and passion, and Diana felt her heart tighten. She couldn't stop thinking about him herself, no matter how hard she tried. "This is wrong, Kevin. We can't." She tried to speak confidently, but her voice was shaking. She knew they had crossed the line, and there was no coming back. But at the same time, every cell of her was reaching out to him. "I know it's wrong. I know we both feel guilty. But I can't pretend that nothing happened, that I don't feel this way about you." He took a step forward, and Diana felt her breathing become ragged. She knew that if she allowed herself to give in to her feelings now, they would both find themselves in an even more difficult situation.
We have to stop before things go too far. We've already made a mistake, Kevin.
But even as she said it, she knew deep down she didn't want to stop. Her inner conflict tore her apart, a sense of guilt for betraying her husband's trust, and a fierce passion for a man she considered close. But not like that. Kevin came closer, almost touching her. Their breaths merged into one, and it seemed that the whole world around them froze.
Diana, I know this is wrong, but I can't give it up. From us.
He gently touched her arm, and Diana closed her eyes, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this moment would change everything, that their relationship would become even more complicated. But she also understood that she could no longer deny her feelings. She looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt, fear, and love. Yes, she couldn't deny it anymore. She was in love with her nephew, and that realization scared her the most.
We can't go on like this, Kevin. We have to stop everything.
But her voice sounded unconvincing. She understood that words were one thing, and her actions were quite another. She had already crossed the border, and it was too late to go back. It's been a few days since Kevin and Diana saw each other again after his brief escape. While Kevin tried to sort out his feelings somehow, Diana continued to live in her cage of doubt and fear. She tried to get back to normal, as if nothing had happened, but every time her thoughts returned to Kevin, everything collapsed. The relationship, which seemed stable and reliable to her, was bursting at the seams. She tried to avoid calls and texts from Kevin. When he returned from the city and found himself next to him again, in the same house, the tension between them became almost unbearable. They tried to keep their distance, tried not to be alone, but it was as useless as trying to stop an approaching storm. Kevin couldn't stand it first. His feelings for Diana only grew stronger every day. He couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't communicate properly with friends, because every thought was only about her. He found himself imagining their moment together over and over again, every time, as if it were a looped film that couldn't be gotten rid of. One evening, when Diana was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, Kevin came into the room. She tensed instinctively, sensing his approach, but did not look up. She didn't want to see him, that would be too much. She knew that if their gazes crossed, she would lose control again. But Kevin wasn't going to let them keep silent.
Diana, we can't do this anymore. It's killing me.
Diana clutched her glass tighter, trying not to look at him. But his words seemed to break through the fragile wall she had been building around herself all these days.
What are you talking about? We've already discussed everything.
But even her voice sounded strained. She knew their conversation wasn't over. Nothing was resolved, except that they both tried to deny their feelings.
No, we haven't discussed anything. We just ran away. Do you think if we keep pretending that everything is fine, it will all disappear by itself?
He spoke with pain in his voice, as if holding on to these feelings was torture for him. And in a way it was. Diana felt the same way. But every time she tried to think about it, she was seized with fear. Fear for your family, for your reputation, for your life.
Kevin, do you realize that this is impossible? We can't be together. Everything that happened, it was a mistake. We're just confused.
Kevin shook his head. He stepped even closer, and now there were only a few steps between them. It was hard for him to look at her and see her struggling with herself, just like he was. But unlike her, he couldn't hold back anymore. He needed to hear the truth.
Are you confused? Are you saying that it was just a mistake? That you don't feel anything? Say it right now, Diana, and I'll leave. I can't live in this state anymore when I don't know what's really going on.
Diana knew that this was the moment of truth. She could have lied. She could have said that she didn't feel anything, that it really was a mistake. But she couldn't. Lying now would be even more destructive than the truth.
Kevin,
She paused, not knowing how to continue. She couldn't say it out loud, because then everything would become real. But Kevin wouldn't let her shut up.
Diana, look at me and tell me, don't you feel anything? Don't you think about me every day? Don't you wake up at night thinking about all this? Because I can't get it out of my head. It's killing me, Diana. If you say you don't feel anything, I'll leave you alone. But I know you can't say that.
Diana couldn't hold back her tears. She hated herself for it. She was a strong woman, used to coping with difficulties, but now everything was falling apart. Her inner world was full of chaos. She knew Kevin was right. She'd been thinking about him every minute since they'd first crossed that line.
I can't say that.
These words hung in the air like a curse. She knew that nothing would be the same from now on. Kevin stepped closer and took her hand. Their touch was both scolding and soothing. He knew she felt the same way, and it gave him strength.
I knew. I've been feeling it all this time. We can't ignore this, Diana. We have to do something. I can't keep living like this.
Diana slowly sank onto the sofa, feeling as if her legs were no longer holding her. She covered her face with her hands, unable to hide anymore. Everything she was afraid of was happening right now. All her barriers have collapsed. Kevin sat down next to her, keeping his hand on hers.
I do not know what to do. I can't ruin everything. This is going to kill me, Kevin. I love my husband, but I can't deny how I feel about you. It's driving me crazy.
Kevin squeezed her hand harder, trying to give her all the support he could. He knew that the situation was terrible. They were both trapped in their feelings and obligations, but he couldn't let her continue to suffer alone.
I don't want to ruin your life, Diana, but I also can't deny that I love you. And if you feel the same way, we need to find a way out. We can't just pretend that nothing happened.
Diana looked at him, her eyes full of pain and fear. She knew this conversation would change everything, but she couldn't live a lie anymore. There was a war inside her between duty and feelings, and she didn't know which side would win.
What do you suggest? We can't just disappear. I have a life, a family.
Kevin sighed. He knew that there would be no easy solutions here. But he also knew that if they continued to ignore their feelings, it would destroy them both.
I do not know what to do, Diana. But I know one thing: if we keep hiding it, it will be worse for both of us. We need to talk. Find a solution. We can't just go to different corners and hope that everything disappears by itself.
Diana knew he was right. She couldn't pretend that nothing was happening anymore, but the thought of what would happen next scared her to the point of trembling. She was on the edge of a precipice, and it seemed only Kevin could keep her from falling.
I'm just afraid that if we go any further, we won't be able to go back. This will be the end.
Kevin nodded. He understood her fears, but he also knew that the end was near if they didn't do something.
Maybe. But I think if we don't try, it will kill us even faster. You know that yourself.
Diana covered her face with her hands again. Her head was full on thoughts. But she knew one thing: Kevin was right. Their feelings were too strong to ignore. Now they were on the threshold of something new, and it was impossible to take a step back. And at that moment, she realized that she had already made her choice. After that meeting, everything changed. Diana and Kevin could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. Their feelings became a part of their lives, and each new day only reinforced this awareness. They no longer tried to deny their attraction, but they could not openly talk about it either. Their relationship has become something secret, forbidden, hidden from everyone. What started out as something impossible and frightening has now become their reality. Diana woke up every morning feeling guilty, but at the same time she couldn't ignore the warmth that enveloped her thoughts about Kevin. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't resist her desires. She felt on edge, as if she was walking on a knife edge, balancing duty and passion. Her heart squeezed with fear every time she thought about her husband, about what would happen if he found out the truth. But as soon as her thoughts returned to Kevin, the fear was replaced by something else, a throbbing passion that she could no longer control. Kevin, in turn, was completely immersed in his feelings for Diana. For him, all this was akin to an obsession, which it was impossible to get rid of. He couldn't think of anything but her. Work, friends, all previous hobbies, everything has become unimportant. The only things that mattered were the moments they spent together, even if they were rare and short. These meetings became a vital necessity for him, and every touch, every stolen glance made him more dependent on her. Their relationship developed in the shadows, in hidden moments. When Diana's husband was at work or away on business, Kevin found a way to meet her. They were playing with fire more and more, meeting in the most unexpected places where no one could catch them. Each such meeting was saturated with adrenaline. The fear of exposure only increased their passion. In these brief but intense moments, they forgot about everything except each other. Time stood still, and the world around them ceased to exist. Each of their meetings was an explosion of emotions. They tried to keep within bounds, to control their desires, but as soon as they were alone, all restraint evaporated. Their touch was full not only of passion, but also of deep tenderness, which they were both afraid to show openly. It was a connection that overshadowed everything they had felt up to this point in their lives. But every time their moments of intimacy ended, harsh reality returned. They both had to go back to their daily lives, pretend that nothing had happened, although inside they burned with a desire to continue what had begun. Diana began to notice how her life was gradually changing. She tried to behave as she always did in front of her husband and friends, but her inner world was in complete chaos. Every morning, when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw another woman in front of her. The one who balanced between duty and forbidden passion. Her conscience was tormenting her, but she couldn't stop. Every time she thought about breaking this connection, her heart ached, and she realized that she could no longer live without Kevin. Kevin has changed too. His friends began to notice that he had become withdrawn and aloof. He was no longer the cheerful guy they knew him to be. All his thoughts were focused on Diana, and it began to affect everything else in his life. He avoided long conversations with friends, did not answer calls, and spent more and more time alone thinking about their relationship. It seemed to him that no one could understand what he was feeling, and he was afraid that his passion for Diana might break out at the most inopportune moment. Their secret had become too heavy to carry alone, but they continued to hold on to it, as if it was the last thread connecting them to something real. The meetings became regular, and each time they became more daring. They met in secluded places in remote parks, on abandoned beaches, in old cafes where no one knew them. There they could be themselves, at least for a short moment. Each meeting was like another leap into the abyss. They both knew that sooner or later everything would come out, but they couldn't stop. Their bond was too strong. They could no longer imagine their lives without these moments, when the world froze around them, and only the two of them existed. Diana began to realize that her feelings for her husband had changed. He remained a kind and caring person, but now she saw him in a completely different way. His touch didn't evoke the emotions she felt around Kevin. Every time he talked to her, her thoughts drifted back to what she and Kevin had done, to those secret meetings that had become her real life. It tore her apart. On the one hand, she loved her husband and didn't want to hurt him. On the other hand, her feelings for Kevin were too strong to ignore. Kevin became more and more immersed in this passion. It was difficult for him to restrain himself when he was with Diana. Every time they met, he felt a growing desire inside him to give up everything and just be with her, openly, without fear. But the reality was brutal. He knew that if they revealed their feelings, it would ruin everything. Their lives would never be the same, and they both knew it. The more they tried to hide their relationship, the more difficult it became to keep it a secret. They began to notice the stares of others. Although no one said anything out loud, it seemed that everyone felt some kind of tension between them. This feeling only increased their fear of being exposed, but also made their moments even more exciting. Unbeknownst to everyone, they continued to meet, hiding from reality, as if it was their own world where no one could penetrate. But their secret relationship began to take its toll on both of them. Diana became more nervous and irritable. Her conscience tormented her, and every time she thought about her husband, she was overcome with guilt. But she couldn't stop. She was drawn to Kevin like a magnet, and she couldn't break the cycle. Every time they met, her heart ached with pain and passion at the same time. Kevin began to lose control of himself. His thoughts were completely engulfed by Diana, and he couldn't think of anything else. He began to avoid any contact with friends, and became more and more distant from his former life. There was only one thing in his mind their next meeting. He couldn't wait for the moment when they would be alone again. This feeling was becoming unbearable for him. He felt like he was losing control of his life, but he was willing to do it in order to be with her again. This went on for several weeks. Their meetings became increasingly passionate and risky. They knew they were playing with fire, but they couldn't stop. Diana began to notice how their bond was affecting her marriage. Her husband began to notice that she was distant and withdrawn, but could not understand what was the matter. It scared her, but she kept hiding the truth. Her life was on the edge, but she couldn't tear herself away from Kevin. Their relationship was like a drug that she couldn't give up, even knowing it could ruin her life. Kevin, in turn, began to think more and more about the future. He understood that their relationship could not last forever in this form. Sooner or later, they will have to make a choice. Either they break off their relationship and return to normal life, or everything will work outside. And then the consequences will be unpredictable. But so far, despite all the risks, they continue to meet, plunging deeper into their passion. Every day was a challenge for them, but they both knew that this path was leading them into the unknown. The relationship between Kevin and Diana was developing rapidly, despite their secret nature. The more time they spent together, the stronger their bond became, and the higher the stakes in this dangerous game rose. However, their passion could not exist without consequences. Jealousy appeared, which gradually corroded them both, and the fear of exposure began to put more and more pressure on them. Diana became more and more immersed in her feelings for Kevin, but it also meant that her relationship with her husband began to crack at the seams. Every day she felt more and more distant from him. She tried to be attentive and caring, but her thoughts always returned to Kevin, to the moments they spent together. This created an internal conflict for her. She loved her husband, but her passion for Kevin became something integral in her life. She began to notice how her husband became more suspicious. He didn't talk about it directly, but she could see it in his eyes, in the awkward pauses in the conversation, in the way he sometimes casually watched her. It was as if he was trying to figure out what was going on. This wariness raised a wave of fear in Diana. She was afraid that her secret was about to be revealed. But every time she thought about stopping everything, her heart ached. She was attracted to Kevin with such force that it seemed impossible to give up these feelings. Jealousy began to appear in the most unexpected moments. Diana found herself getting nervous when she saw her husband talking to other women, whether they were colleagues or just acquaintances. Although she was well aware that her feelings and actions were fundamentally wrong, this did not negate the fact that she was afraid of losing control of the situation. Her own infidelities and secret affair with Kevin made her see a threat in her husband's every female conversation. Every time she saw him with another woman, it seemed to her that this was a hint that he might also be attracted to someone, as she was attracted to Kevin. She knew that these feelings were irrational, but she couldn't help herself. Kevin, in turn, felt no less crushed under the weight of his passion and jealousy. He understood that Diana still belonged to another person, and it tore him apart from the inside. Every time he saw her with her husband, whether at family gatherings, in photos on social media, or even just heard about him from her, he was overcome with jealousy. It was hard for Kevin to realize that he could not be open with Diana, that their relationship would always be a secret. He craved more, craved her whole, but he knew that it was impossible under the circumstances. Kevin's jealousy wasn't just about Diana's husband. He began to notice how other men looked at her, how they behaved in her presence. One day, when they met in a cafe on the outskirts of the city, he couldn't help but notice how the waiter stared at Diana for too long while serving them coffee. A wave of anger rose inside him, although he tried to hold it back. These moments began to affect his behavior. He became more nervous and irritable. His constant thoughts that someone else might be attracted to Diana drove him crazy. However, jealousy was not the only problem that destroyed them. The fear of exposure began to engulf them on both sides. Diana was afraid that her husband would notice how she had changed, how her attitude towards him had become more cold and distant. Every time he asked her questions about her day, she tried to speak as briefly as possible, afraid that she might give herself away with some careless word or intonation. She carefully hid her feelings, trying to maintain a semblance of normality, but fear and anxiety bubbled inside her. Kevin, for his part, also couldn't shake the feeling that sooner or later their secret would be revealed. He constantly looked back when they met, peering into the faces of passers-by, afraid to see a familiar face. Every phone call, every unexpected knock on the door made his heart clench with fear that it might be someone who would find out about them. He began to feel paranoid, which haunted him even in those moments when they were together. It seemed to him that someone would definitely see them, that their secret was too big to be hidden forever. One day, when Kevin came to Diana's house to spend the evening with her, he noticed that her husband had left his phone on the kitchen table. Kevin froze for a moment, feeling a wave of panic rise inside him. He knew that Diana's husband was not supposed to be at home, and his sudden appearance or return could lead to disaster. But even more frightening was that now it seemed to him that his husband could return at any moment. Fear gripped Kevin so much that he could barely hide his anxiety, but Diana, sensing his tension, convinced him that everything was under control. But no matter how hard they tried to keep everything under control, it was impossible. Secret meetings, constant lies, and concealment of the truth began to turn into an unbearable burden. Diana felt the fear of exposure begin to destroy her from the inside. She became more withdrawn, talking less to her husband, afraid that any word might betray her. She could no longer look into his eyes the same way as before, and that made her even more anxious. Every time her husband asked why she left the house so often in the evenings, or who she was talking to on the phone, her heart sank with fear. She came up with 1,000 excuses, but every time she spoke, her voice trembled, and it seemed to her that he felt it. Her life turned into a continuous expectation that everything was about to collapse, that her husband would find out the truth, and their marriage would be destroyed. Kevin wasn't in a better position. He felt that their game with fire had reached a critical point. He was constantly thinking that someone they knew might accidentally notice them together. Even the usual meetings with friends or family became a challenge for him, because it seemed to him that everyone already knew what was going on between him and Diana. He began to avoid people, trying to stay out of sight, and this only increased his anxiety. But the fear of exposure could not stop their connection. The more they tried to be careful, the stronger their feelings became. Every meeting now was filled not only with passion, but also with despair. They both knew that time was working against them. The longer they continued their relationship, the higher the risk that their secret would be revealed. Every day that passed without incident seemed like a gift from fate. But both Diana and Kevin understood that this could not go on forever. Their passion overshadowed their common sense, and even realizing that they were playing on the verge of destroying their lives, they couldn't stop. Every moment together was like the last, filled not only with love, but also with fear that this might be the end. The jealousy they felt and the fear of exposure became the main driving forces of their relationship. They lived in constant tension, and it destroyed them both. But the more they suffered from it, the more dependent they became on each other. Every meeting, every touch was saturated with the realization that it could end at any moment, and that was what made their connection so strong and painful. Diana and Kevin sank deeper into their secret swamp of feelings and fear, knowing that getting out of it would be no less painful than what they were experiencing now. A few weeks passed, and Diana and Kevin's life became more and more a game on the edge. Their passion continued to flare up despite all the dangers, but every day the fear of exposure became stronger. They tried to control themselves, but they realized that their bond was starting to destroy everything around them. Diana's life with her husband turned into a series of lies, hidden glances, and nervous meetings. She was getting further and further away from him, and her feelings for Kevin overshadowed everything else. Kevin, in turn, was caught up in his addiction to Diana. He could not imagine his life without her, but at the same time he understood that their relationship could not continue in this form. And so, when they were almost used to their difficult game, the moment came that changed everything. One morning, Diana woke up in her bed, feeling strangely tense. Something was wrong. She reached for her phone to check the messages from Kevin, but saw only one notification from her husband. He sent a short message saying that his business trip had ended earlier than expected and he was already on his way home. Those few lines fell on her like a bolt from the blue. Diana felt her heart stop and then beat wildly. She quickly got out of bed and began to pace the room nervously. She had only a few hours left before her husband would appear on her doorstep. Everything that had seemed under control was now threatening to collapse. Earlier, Diana knew that she had time, that her husband would not return for at least another week, and she could afford short meetings with Kevin. But now the situation has changed. She felt trapped. The moment that seemed inevitable but far away was now coming. Her husband was coming back, and she knew that her life, her marriage, and her relationship with Kevin could change in an instant. Panic began inside her. How will she be able to handle it? How can she continue to lead a double life if her husband is around again? Her every move will be under control. Her every look and action can betray her. Diana tried to calm down and pull herself together. She knew it was important not to make mistakes right now. She had to return to the usual mode of life with her husband, behave as if nothing had changed. But deep down, she knew that it would be almost impossible. Too much has happened in recent months. She had changed too much, and her feelings for Kevin had become a part of her life. She couldn't just turn them off like they turn off a light. Her mind was racing. She wondered what would happen to Kevin. They were supposed to meet later that day, but now it has become impossible. She didn't know how to tell him that. She couldn't just disappear without explanation, but meeting him now could be a disaster. The husband could arrive at any moment, and any mistake could ruin everything. Despite all these fears, Diana began to act. She removed all traces of Kevin's presence in the house, hid his things that he left during their meetings, removed photos and souvenirs that could raise questions. She cleaned everything carefully, almost mechanically, trying not to think that everything would be different now. Her hands were shaking, but she continued to act like an automaton. She knew that the main thing now was to make sure that nothing would arouse suspicion. When everything was ready, Diana sat down on the sofa and looked out the window. Her head was full of thoughts about how she would behave with her husband, how she would react to his questions and behavior. She imagined scenarios of what might happen if he suspected something. Inwardly, she was already preparing for the fact that she would have to lie, manipulate, hide her real feelings. But these thoughts only increased her fear. She had never lived such a constant lie before, and now it all threatened to come out. The hours passed slowly, but eventually she heard the sound of a car approaching. Her husband returned home. Diana felt her insides tighten. She got up from the couch, took several deep breaths, trying to calm her breathing and heartbeat. The door opened, and her husband entered the house looking tired but pleased. He immediately went up to her, hugged her and kissed her. Diana tried not to show her emotions, responding to his embrace the way she had done before. But everything inside her screamed. She could feel his touch, his scent, but her thoughts were far away. Her whole mind was consumed with thoughts about Kevin, about how they could continue their relationship now that her husband was back. She was afraid that any wrong step, any little thing could give her away. Still, she tried to maintain a semblance of normality. Her husband began to talk about his trip, about how his meetings went, about plans for the future. Diana was sitting next to him, listening to him, nodding, but her thoughts were in a completely different place. His every word seemed to pass her by. Her heart was enthralled to fear, fear of exposure, fear that she might not see Kevin again. The next few days were a real challenge for Diana. Her husband stayed at home, spent time with her, and she had to play the role of a loving wife. She tried to be the person he knew her to be, but it was getting harder. Every day she woke up feeling trapped. His every touch was a reminder to her that her real life was now hidden from him. Her body and mind belonged to another person, but she had to hide it in order to maintain the appearance of a normal life. Kevin, in turn, felt abandoned and lost. After Diana informed him that her husband had returned earlier than expected, he realized that their meetings would now be at even greater risk. He felt that he was losing her, that now everything could be over. He tried not to think about it, but he was overcome with jealousy and anger. He couldn't accept that Diana would come back to life with her husband, that now she would be with him, and Kevin would stay away. He began to feel helpless. For the first time, he realized that he had no control over the situation. All this chaos they had plunged into was now beyond his control, and although he understood that he could not demand that Diana leave her husband, his inner world was torn apart. He wanted to be with her, wanted to openly declare his feelings, but he knew that this would lead to disaster. There was a storm of emotions raging inside him, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Every day he waited for messages from Diana, but they became less frequent. She wrote him short sentences, trying to keep in touch, but she couldn't be as frank as before. Her husband was there, and that made any communication dangerous. Kevin could feel them moving away, their bond weakening, but there was nothing he could do about it. Diana, on the other hand, was feeling increasingly depressed. Her life turned into a series of lies and fear. She wanted to be with Kevin, but she knew it would be even more difficult now. She could no longer freely date him like she used to. Her husband was by her side, and his every look, every word caused her anxiety. She felt that she was teetering on the edge, and any wrong step could ruin everything. Despite this, Diana couldn't give up on Kevin. Her feelings for him were too strong to just break the bond. But she understood that everything had changed now. Their relationship became even more risky, even more forbidden, and every step could lead to disaster. She lived in a state of constant tension, trying to hide her real feelings, but she couldn't get rid of the thought that sooner or later, all this would come out. Thus began a new stage in their relationship, a stage in which the fear of exposure and the inability to continue dating as before became the main obstacles. Diana and Kevin came to the point where it was simply impossible to pull any further. Diana's husband, who returned ahead of time, completely changed the dynamics of their forbidden meetings. Everything that once seemed controlled was gradually turning into chaos. Their secret passion, fueled by the fear of exposure, became a heavy burden. Every day brought more and more tension, and the question of what to do next became more and more urgent. Diana could no longer pretend that her life with her husband remained the same. He began to notice her detachment, her frequent closed states and nervous reactions. The husband tried to be understanding, but his patience was gradually wearing thin. He started asking more questions, spending more time at home, and this increased her sense of anxiety. Everything she had been hiding from him began to come out in small details: her nervous movements, frequent glances at the phone, which she hastily hid as soon as he entered the room. Diana understood that she could no longer continue this game forever. The situation was heating up, and she needed to make a decision. Every time she was with her husband, she was overcome with guilt. She loved him, but not the way she used to. Everything had changed since Kevin had entered her life. It wasn't just moments of passion, it was a real emotional attachment that she couldn't ignore. She knew that she was betraying the man who had been with her for many years, the man who had been faithful to her and cared for her. But her heart was no longer his. It belonged to Kevin, and the thought tore her apart. Time passed slowly. Each of their meetings with Kevin, which now happened less and less often because of her husband's presence, seemed to be the last. These meetings became increasingly desperate, imbued with the feeling that everything could end at any moment. They both knew that the situation had gone too far, that they could no longer continue in the same spirit, but they could not let each other go. Their bond was too strong, too deep. Even when they weren't together, their thoughts kept returning to each other. Kevin also felt that their relationship had reached a critical moment. He could no longer tolerate this uncertainty, this eternal fear of being exposed. It was hard for him to stay away, knowing that Diana was spending time with her husband, leading a normal family life with him, while he, Kevin, remained on the sidelines. This feeling haunted him. He wanted to be with Diana openly, without hiding, but he understood that this would destroy not only her life, but also his own. Nevertheless, he felt that he could not continue to live like this. One evening, when Diana was alone with herself again, she realized that she could no longer ignore reality. She had to make a choice. She couldn't keep lying to her husband, living with this constant fear that he would find out the truth. But she also couldn't imagine her life without Kevin. Their meetings had become the raison d'etre of her existence, and the idea that she should sever all ties with him seemed unbearable. This internal struggle was tearing her apart. For several days she hardly slept, thinking about what to do. She tried to find a way out that wouldn't ruin her life, but every option seemed impossible. If she tells her husband the truth, it will destroy him. He was a good man, and she knew he didn't deserve it. But she couldn't keep lying to him either. She felt like she was living in a trap from which there was no way out. Kevin, in turn, was also on the edge. He felt that he was losing Diana, that her life with her husband was gradually displacing him from her thoughts. He began to suffer from insomnia, his work deteriorated, and his friends began to notice that something was wrong with him. He couldn't hide his feelings anymore. For him it was no longer just an intrigue or a passionate affair, it became his reality, and he understood that either they would be together openly or everything would end forever. One day, Diana decided to meet with Kevin to discuss what would happen next. She knew this was going to be a difficult conversation, perhaps the most difficult one of her life. When they met at their usual place, an old cafe on the outskirts of the city, the tension between them was almost palpable. She could feel her heart pounding as they looked at each other, knowing that this moment could be a turning point. They spent several hours together, considering various options. Diana knew she couldn't leave her husband just like that. She had been with him for many years. They had a life together, plans, memories. But on the other hand, she couldn't imagine her life without Kevin. Their bond was too strong to ignore. Every time they tried to figure out what to do, they came back to the same thought: either they would be together, or their relationship should end forever. This choice was a real test for both of them. On the one hand, they understood that their connection was destroying everything around them. Diana saw her relationship with her husband deteriorate. She couldn't talk to him the way she used to, couldn't look into his eyes without feeling guilty. Every day was a torment for her. But every time she thought about ending her relationship with Kevin, she felt a sense of despair. Kevin, in turn, suffered from the fact that he could not fully be with Diana. He understood that their relationship would never be normal as long as she remained married. He couldn't continue to live on the sidelines of her life, knowing that she returned to her husband every day. It was unbearable for him. He wanted to be open with her, but he knew that it would ruin her marriage and possibly change their lives forever. Eventually, Diana realized that she would have to make a choice, no matter how painful it was. She realized that it was no longer possible to continue this double relationship. Her husband was beginning to suspect something, and she could no longer live in constant fear that the truth would come out. She also understood that if she didn't let Kevin go, their relationship would continue to destroy her from the inside out. This internal conflict was killing her, and she couldn't take it anymore. After much thought, Diana made a decision. She knew it would hurt, that it would change her life forever. But she understood that she could no longer continue to live a lie. She had to take responsibility for what happened. Her choice was clear: she couldn't leave her husband without destroying everything they had built together. But she also couldn't continue a relationship with Kevin, knowing that it was ruining her life. Diana knew that this choice would be the hardest for her in her life. She loved Kevin, but she had to let him go. She understood that she could no longer continue to balance between two lives. Now she had to gather her will into a fist and take this painful but necessary step. She was aware that none of the paths would be easy, but the choice was made. And even though her heart was bursting with pain, Diana knew that this was the only way to get her life back to normal. She decided that she would tell Kevin about her decision the next time they met. It would be the end of their relationship, but she hoped it would give them both the opportunity to move on, despite all the pain they would experience.